What's hot at PAX Australia 2018? Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, is proudly brought to you by Belkin. Welcome to Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, where we channel surf through the headlines in search of the big picture. I'm Adam Turner, and once again we've taken the show on the road this week, driving the Vertical Hold outside broadcast van over to PAX at Jeff's Shed in Melbourne. Alex is recuperating after his big trip to London, so we've got two great guests returning to the show this week. First up, we're joined once again by Kotaku editor Alex Walker. Alex, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Also joining us, haven't seen him for a while, Seamus Byrne, longtime friend of the show, freelance technology journalist, and also host of the new Blizzard podcast, The Scrapyard. Seamus, welcome back to the show.
It is nice to come back. Thanks for having me.
So guys, we're here at PAX. It's Saturday afternoon, so we're about halfway through the show. Lots to see, what's to do. What's caught your eye, Seamus?
It's funny, there's so many cool games out there, but the first thing that absolutely caught my eye was a VR cricket game. And it was kind of just this weird thing over on the side, but on that first day, when the queue is short, you think, okay, if I'm ever going to dive in and give this a try, I'll do it now, which was good because the queues are now quite long for it. But, basically it's like batting practice in VR, but it felt really good. And it's such a cool experience to sit there and look like you are, in the middle of a stadium and you're facing up, and just everything about it actually felt really good. I played a couple of nice shots through the covers, and then I did start trying to kind of mix it up and think, how do I play with the line of the ball? And then ended up trying to dance down the wicket and then had my head pulled backwards by the cable. And it's like, oh yeah, I'm kind of forgetting I'm in VR.
So I'm not on the MCG, yeah. What kind of hardware was it?
So it was running on the new Vive Pro system. I have a Vive at home, and I can't help but feel like now that I've put a Vive Pro on my head, that I am now going to suddenly go home and go, oh, this one looks bad. Now I need to find $1,000 to upgrade.
So for those who are playing along at home, Seamus has the full setup. He's done the lounge room with the cameras in the corner and the whole thing, the envy of the neighbourhood, I believe.
Yes, whenever kids' friends come over, we always have a bit of a session, and then the parent comes round to pick up the kid, takes a look and goes, yeah, can I have a go as well?
And Alex, what's caught your eye?
So the biggest thing on the tabletop section, which is the second half of PAX, is Azul. So Azul's one of the Spiel des Jahres winners, which are basically the major board game awards that get given out every year. They give out different categories for, things like Euro games, things like your big war games. Azul is on the simpler side, so you're looking at about a 45-minute game, and it's a game about drafting tiles to create your own mosaic. So it's a sort of thing where everybody is sort of making picks and making the best of a worst choice, almost. It's very colourful, it's very tactile, it's very pretty. It's also very good for people who are colourblind, which is an important thing when it's a game about, colours and patterns. So you have to go and buy it. People are essentially just buying copies of the game so they can play it because they don't have enough to show around, they don't have enough for enforcers to teach people, and you're just seeing people in lines. Like, I've been back a few times and people go, oh, are you returning us all? And I'm like, no, we're borrowing it. Like, it's been around, it's not new at PAX, but it is kind of just getting into consistent supply around Australia at local board game shops, and that's all you're seeing. Everybody wants to play it.
Is there much of a turnover year on year in the tabletop section? Because I know, like, looking at the PAX Rising section with the indie games, you see a few familiar faces there every year. You see the new ones coming through. What's the turnover like in that tabletop area?
I think the tabletop is probably the most consistent part of PAX. In a ways, it's actually been expanded and adjusted a little bit. So in terms of the amount of space that the tabletop takes up, they've actually compressed more into that area, whereas the expo hall has been sort of jutted out a little bit. So booths are a bit more further apart. The booth sizes themselves are just a little bit roomier than what they used to. The PAX Indie space is a good example of that. But in the tabletop area, they've added the PAX Collaborative, so essentially working with, almost think like an early access program for board games. You go and you test, and they used to do this at PAX previously, where you go and you'd sit down in the free play area, and they'd be like, hey, do you want to play a game? I'm working on it. And you just sit down with the designer and you help them work through things. And there's been a ton of things that have been on Kickstarter that have been play tested at PAX this way, and the PAX Collab is kind of a more formalized way for them to do that. Definitely want to try something that's upcoming, you can go there to do it rather than just doing it within the free play area and discovering it.
Yeah, I also noticed in the indie section that there were a few games that were Kickstarters as well, where when PAX first started a couple of years ago, they weren't talking so much about Kickstarter. How important is Kickstarter becoming to indie games developers?
Kickstarter's worn off a little bit, I think, because like initially in the first couple of years of PAX, so before it was here at the Melbourne Convention Centre and the first one when it was out at Flemington, that was the age where you still had Australian games making $250,000, $300,000, $350,000 on Kickstarter. That was when you had your Satellite Rains, your Armellos. Now, those games have come and gone and they've had multi-platform launches. Most Australian games and most Australian board games, especially tabletop, because tabletop makes most of their funding through Kickstarter. Most major tabletop publishers will go direct through Kickstarter rather than releasing a game and taking the risk. Video games tend to either just release this full product or try it through early access because people are more averse to Kickstarter failures, and there's been quite a few over the years. So Kickstarter's still a thing, but the highs of what people used to have for video games, your Broken Ages, your $3 million projects, your $2 million, that doesn't happen anymore. Like the video games have kind of passed on that high because there's been too many failures and people have got too much of a sour taste in the mouth these days.
And Seamus, I also noticed that the way VR is dispersed throughout PAX has changed over the last couple of years as well. There was a time when it was a bit of a novelty thing and you'd see it on every stand just to say, hey, look, we've got a VR, but people are now using it a bit more selectively.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few specific games that people are working on out there, but I think you're right that we're sort of into a different phase at the moment where, people know that, all right, like VR doesn't have that traction in every home that, people thought it might have had by now, but it's also still really expensive to have a good setup. So instead we are seeing, like, there's one particular bit, like where the cricket was, there are like 3 different VR games in that sort of little kind of section. So there's like a tiny little hub there showing off some ideas. There's the Guns for Hands, like weird VR game, but it's been here a couple of times now, but it's sort of still on show. There's also another Aussie indie game that is like specifically they're launching on PlayStation VR, which just kind of seemed weird to me because I don't know, it didn't seem like that kind of has any more traction than any other platform necessarily, but I don't know the numbers, I might be wrong. But it was quite cool in that it was like a board game in VR, so that it is about sort of just sitting there and having this kind of seated experience where you're looking at this sort of changing board game in front of you and with sort of cool interactions. But then they do have the VR free play space right down the back hall, and they've tried to, when it comes to the free play things here, you've got like the bring your own computer stuff, and you've got the console free play areas and all the kind of different sections where it is that idea of you come and you just hang out and you just play stuff, like even like the retro free play area. Yeah. But the VR one, does seem to sort of be oversubscribed in a sense, where
the queue was 2 hours long to get into the VR free play.
Yeah, and I think there's that element where it's not the same as, say, for console free play. If you want to come here, and part of it is just hanging out with a bunch of friends and like, let's sit around and play Street Fighter or let's play whatever game we want to play together. I think lots of people still want to actively seek out a VR experience, and it does sort of mean that probably needs to be better managed in terms of the time of letting people come through, have a bit of time with the experience, but then say, okay, we can't let you just stay here for 2 hours because there's not enough. It also takes up a lot more room than just 50 consoles in a row versus 5 VR systems is probably the ratio. Yeah.
Did they have any of the wireless connectors here on the show floor?
I think I saw one booth that did have the wireless setup. I can't remember which game it was, but there's just there. Oh, it's look, there was one particular game, I can't remember the name of it, where they were trying to do this room scale setup, but where you could actually, the idea was that you would walk around within the world in a way that most games don't kind of let you. So they were using the wireless controller to make sure you felt as free as possible. But the wireless is a new like add-on that you can attach to the HTC Vive, so that you don't if you're trying to dance down the pitch, for instance, you won't find out that that you're getting. Though instead, you'll just run into the couch.
But that's going to be a harder thing to show off at shows like this, because to do free roaming VR justice, you really need the space. You can't do it if you're in a booth. You may as well just have a Vive on with the cable going up and hanging down from the roof. How do you think that people will make the most of it? I mean, I've played the Melbourne Zero Latency, which is you're literally in a warehouse fighting zombies. There's half a dozen people in there. As you say, it has in-game sensors. If you come up near a real-world wall, it sort of pops up to let you know. And when you first put it on, you think, I can't run around with this thing, like it's not safe. But you just immediately feel immersed in the world. And once you know where those boundaries are, you find yourself running and ducking and shooting at zombies or whatever. How do you get across an experience like that in a small booth at a show?
I think the short answer is you don't. I think that the stuff that the Zero Latency crew has done, I think that in so many ways it feels like that's going to be the predominant future of VR, where very few people are going to do like I did and hook it up into their living room. At least in the 3 to 5 year timeline is my guess. Hey, 50 years from now, we'll probably won't even need half the gear that is attached to it. It'll be 5G magic. But yeah, I think it's that nice to come and have the novel experience in a place like this. But it is just about somebody showing things off. But you're like, how many copies is someone going to ever sell of their VR game? I think it's such a limiting thing right now, where the footprint of how many people are actually your audience, and even discovering games, right? Like, I actively, go through Steam looking for new VR games. But I'm sure there's plenty of people who, even if they got their rig, might be like, there's 3 VR games I love to spend time in, and that's it. Almost like the old Wii Sports thing. It's like, well, I just love hanging out in this. Like, I know people who are like, I play Elite Dangerous in VR, and that's all I do in VR, because it's amazing, yeah.
Like a problem, CCP Games, the makers of EVE Online, and they bet big on VR, and they did EVE Valkyrie, which was like launched for the PSVR, was a big launch title for the Oculus Store when it came out. They said VR is essentially not financially sustainable for them right now. They thought it was going to be 2 or 3 times larger than it was going to be. And for a company like ReadPop, which runs PAX Australia and Oz Comic Con and all the rest, it's a major business problem as well, because VR requires a large amount of space. At the moment, they're having to give that space and allow developers to use that, rather than selling that space as traditional booth, as a Sony or a Ubisoft or someone would buy. And as VR is less and less popular, people are happy to come and try it out. That's why there's long queues, but they're not making money off it. So it becomes like a vicious cycle. And it's problematic, and it's sad, because there's so many things that VR can do that you can't do in other scenarios. Even something like you were mentioning, the board game, like Tabletop Simulator is one of the biggest little niche things on Steam, because it's, board games do not often get good digital conversion. So what happens is those games get added into Tabletop Simulator as DLC, and people muck around, and that makes sense for a VR environment. But they're not making money off it, so it's hard. It's really difficult. We'll probably end up, like, cinemas will be another thing like Zero Latency, where it just becomes a special experience, and that's how they make that viable.
I did notice that VR had crept into the indie section as well. There was VR chess, but it was a little bit different. So it was a chess game that you were playing in VR, but somehow it was like a 4-sided chess game. And you could control 2 sides, and the other person could control 2 sides, and you had special moves. And my son had a go at it. He was like, I had to tear him away from it. I admit I don't quite totally understand the rules, but you could really see how they'd taken the old and the new and melded them together. How do you think that people look, rather than just taking old games like checkers or chess and whatever and dropping them in as downloadable content, how do you think that new games might start to blend the board and the virtual world?
Blending the board and the virtual world. I think instances of making... So there was a game that I think War Tile that came out earlier this year, and the way that they did it was essentially it was a turn-based strategy game, and they just used the 3D art that they could to make the most beautiful dioramas possible. And that was their solution to it. It's not a VR thing. It was just making it essentially, because one of the best things of board games is the tactile element, the beautiful components. And so using the advantages of things like Unreal Engine or what you can do with Unity and making that as stunning as possible and sort of making it a scope thing so you can zoom into a very small microscopic level and making it immersive on a screen that way. Because one, that's something that most people can access, and also makes it multi-platform, so you don't have to worry about PC requirements or somebody having to have like a VR compatible phone or all the rest of it. I think that's probably the simplest way forward. I think that's also, like, in terms just from a development standpoint, getting more artists is easier to scope than, say, getting VR programmers, working out latency problems, working out netcode, that sort of thing. So still, pretty much as a single player pursuit, I think, is the way that they manage that.
Yeah, I think there's also some really cool stuff with how people are using VR, rather than thinking of it as a game experience, they're often looking at ideas like, say, with Dota, around a major tournament, they have this really cool immersive VR environment that you can watch a tournament in, where within VR, what it looks like is you've got a really big screen up in front of you of the actual kind of esports stream. Then below that is like a live view of the actual map of like the whole board, so you can see where like all the different characters are on the board in real time. And then like sitting down either side are all the characters that people chose for this particular match, with like stats underneath them all. So you're like kind of sitting there in this really kind of interesting immersive space, being able to sit back, like you're almost in a movie theater watching the whole game, plus all this extra stats and details that you wouldn't get if you were just watching it on the standard sort of esports Twitch stream. So that's kind of cool. And then the other side of it is sometimes more around things like when people are trying to just play like RPGs together or things remotely. And I mean, that it probably works better by just playing it on screen rather than in the full VR environment. But there are a lot of these sorts of tabletop crossover ideas where, if you've played Dungeons & Dragons with a bunch of mates for years and years, but you don't live in the same city anymore, now you can use these kind of really cool virtual tabletops to be able to still get together over a VoIP connection. Might even support video cameras so you can see each other, but then you've got your virtual board to play out any combat actions and stuff, and that's kind of cool as well.
And that solves problem as well, like with D&D, because you've got having to move all the stuff off your table so you can fit like the player mat and things like that. You were mentioning like a virtual hub like Rec Room, which is a free-to-play game on Steam, and it's one of the biggest VR things there. Essentially does that, gives a little virtual space that's like an indoor sports, essentially. Go around, play ping pong, play some basketball, volleyball, whatever it is. And a lot of people have fun just essentially throwing stuff at each other's faces. So I think like something like that, where you give people a world to inhabit that's attached to other activities they like, that they can drop in and drop out of. Like that seems to have had the most success out of a lot of the VR, aside from things like Elite Dangerous, but then that's also like Elite Dangerous is a niche game.
Yeah. I did see something very cool down in the tabletop section that is the reverse of that. It was a physical kitchen table with a sliding top on it. So you could set up your game on the table, and it was almost like a craps table where it's got a bit of a side on it. So you could set your game down there. There was perspex that you could draw on if you wanted a map or whatever, but then when you wanted to finish, you just slid the table back over and you could eat dinner off it without having to move everything. What you're talking about is kind of the virtual equivalent of that, isn't it? You can set the game up in VR and then not have to worry about packing it away again.
Well, yeah, that's it, because, again, like D&D and those sorts of games, they're very close-knit. They're very, you want that interaction. You want people around, but you don't want to have to give up. Like, their campaigns can run for years, like 2, 3, 4, 5 years sometimes. You don't want to have to give that up just because somebody's gone away to work, and then if you miss a few sessions, then everything starts to fall together. So VR can work really well for that. But also that's something people like. Something that's really successful on Kickstarter is a lot of miniatures, a lot of tactile, large modular things. So things like elaborate designed dice towers, for instance. Those make a lot of money on Kickstarter. I saw like modular tables. They're hugely successful. Those are the things that will post your $1 million plus campaign still, because they solve problems. That's why, the virtual environment, it's sort of, and for D&D, it actually becomes useful. And so things like that are always going to be hugely successful because people, it doesn't matter how old you are, you don't want to have to give up tabletop especially. People have so many memories and you have so many laughs with it. So stuff like that is great to see.
No one likes packing away their toys. It doesn't matter how old you are.
Oh, God. Yeah, especially. And especially if you sit there, you go down to eat and then it's suddenly like, oh, God, now we've got to move everything, but I still want some chips. I'm still hungry. And I'm like, oh, but then I've got grease on the sheet. Oh, crap. And then, it's perfect. Just...
Oh, the cat jumped on the table. Oh, God, the pieces are everywhere. Yeah.
So, Seamus, you mentioned before about esports. We've seen some big esports action here.
Yeah, I think it's funny, actually. It almost ebbs and flows. I feel like a few years ago, they had some really big esports stage stuff here. It wasn't so big. The last, maybe 2 years ago, it was pretty small. And then I think they're always trying to find what's the best way to do something that isn't just necessarily, the show match type thing where you just get a couple of teams to turn up and have a game, but there's nothing on the line. They want to try to find ways to do something that's a little more interesting than that. But they have definitely sort of made sure there's a big stage kind of space here, and then at different times of the day, there's been teams playing League of Legends, there's been teams playing Rainbow Six, and just kind of all sorts of different things, featuring some of the big Australian teams that people are big fans of. But there's definitely still that element of, I'm not quite sure if anything was technically at stake. There's probably a couple of prize pools, I imagine, that were attached to some of the matches that they've held. But yeah, I think, there's kind of the wider big news this week of Order, who's one of the teams who was playing some stuff here, actually, opening up crowdfunding for their team. So right back when they announced that team at the end of last year, they said they wanted it to be something that fans could feel like they had a real stake in, and it was trying to sort of think of itself more like a traditional, football club or something where you could almost feel like you're a member. But in this sense, they've actually, just as of I think Wednesday, kicked off the public part of a crowdfunding system, a bit like Kickstarter, but actually fully ASIC approved. So it's completely legit that you will have a share in the company. I think minimum buy-in is about $100, and they're capping it out at about $1 million total. The minimum was about $100,000, and I think they're already at 150. So it's kind of quite interesting that I actually spoke to the guy who runs that team earlier in the week, and he said that it really is about, he's always been an Essendon football member, for most of his life, and he feels that real connection to that club. And so he kind of wants to try to open that door to saying, well, how do we start to build some of that feeling of real, I am part of this club and I'm passionately a supporter of this club. And so that's what they've tried to do with Order, and I think it will be interesting to see how they generate that income over the next few weeks.
So is that the idea of equity crowdfunding?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is. I think when you read the official docs, it points out that the cap is about $1 million, but that it's based on a company valuation of $5 million. So I'm sure at some stage it is that idea. I'm not sure of the complexities of can you then sell that share or not later on? But part of it as well is that they've done kind of reward tiers, a lot like you'd find in any other Kickstarter type campaign, where if you come in at about $100, it's you'll get a hat, you'll get this or that. So there's a bit of a merch type association with it, right through to, I think, if you put through $25,000, you'll get a whole bunch of different rewards, but including, you'll be flown to Melbourne to go and kind of train with the team and get all these sorts of extra perks of being at that sort of level. So it is quite interesting to see how they're playing with it, and they pointed out that it's also a mix of people who are just fans and want to have their $100 worth of ownership, but that they have had some people kicking in tens of thousands, essentially as more of an investment, into this club. So they're clearly, from that point, I guess there is going to be some way that down the track someone can go, oh well, I will actually get a return on this, because it's as you say, it's kind of more this equity style of crowdfunding. But yeah, I think it's just kind of a cool move in my mind, in that I feel like it speaks to the idea that they're trying to do more than just just go, well, it's just about playing some games in a sport, and we'll see if we make money or not. But they have quite a heavy-hitting board of directors attached to their club, and they're clearly really trying to think of how does this become a sustainable business that does also then treat the players really well and in a really kind of mature way, instead of just there's plenty of occasions of players getting horribly abused through these kinds of things, and they end up not getting paid and it all falls apart one day.
Are there any votes attached to the equity?
Yeah, I didn't drill that far into the document, I have to say, but that's, I think, definitely an interesting part of it, because there's always different classes of stocks in different kinds of companies.
I smell a hostile takeover.
Yeah, right. If someone comes in and drops like $800,000 into that thing, I'd imagine them as a board might be like, who's this exactly, and what are they looking for? I'm not quite sure exactly how that side of it works.
Because it's interesting, it reminds me, there was a football club like in a few tiers in the conference. They tried a similar thing. They about 12 years ago, they launched equity crowdfunding, and they gave all of their members a vote. So they're essentially, but there was a problem because when you've got a football club, you've got like weekly coaching decisions and things like that are open to, and you've got like people voting on them, and the coach is going, these people know nothing. But something like esports, you're dealing with like a lot fewer people, so it's kind of, you have less of that. But also what I love about this is it solves one of the biggest problems that esports has always had, and that teams need to be making regular content to make themselves, interesting and to keep themselves front of mind. And when you've got that regular connection that you have to have with your investors and things that you can do, whether they're voting or not, and looping them in, that's a constant story that you can keep having, which is really, really beneficial, because you need to keep feeding that beast over time, like, we do in media. So, and also having that different tiers of funding solves that problem. You can have, options at the low end, but you're not also throwing away higher end investors, whether they're angel investors or maybe if it's a company looking for sponsorship or to buy a piece of it or something like that. You can serve that whole market. It's a modern model, which is nice to see. Like, we're finally, how long has it been? We're finally in a space where we can actually see people and teams have something that's sensible and just a little more grown up in a way, which is nice. It's taken so long.
And so, Alex, what else caught your eye?
There is a game about competitive lawnmower racing. It's in the PAX Indie show floor. You've got 4 people. They run around, they mow grass, they get money for mowing the grass, as kids should. Don't run into the side of the lawnmower, you'll get chopped up. It runs for 3 rounds. It's great. Go play it. It is called Lethal Lawns, which is appropriate.
Lethal Lawns. Watch out for it, people. Well, that just about wraps it up for another episode of Vertical Hold. Seamus, thanks for joining us again.
Yeah, really good to be here.
Alex, thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks everyone for listening. Remember, if you like what you hear, hit that subscribe button. Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, is proudly brought to you by Belkin.